It started because of one thing: favoritism. My parents had always made it clear. My younger sister Emily was the star, and I was the shadow. When she wanted piano lessons, they bought her a grand piano. When I needed new shoes for school, they said, "Maybe next month." I didn't complain. I thought love would come later, after I achieved enough to make them proud. So when I finally graduated with my MBA, I believed that night would be my redemption. I paid for a private dinner at a riverside restaurant, arranged every flower, every candle, every seat. I wanted them to see me, really see me, for once in my life. My name is Grace Mitchell. I'm 28 years old, and that night was supposed to be a celebration of everything I'd fought for. Instead, it became the night I stopped being their daughter. Before I take you there, let me ask you something. Have you ever worked your whole life just to earn love from people who never gave it freely? If you have, if you've ever been the one holding a family together while being treated like you never mattered, this story is for you. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more family stories like this. Stories that remind us we're not alone. When my parents arrived, they were late as always. My mother, Helen, looked perfect, wearing pearls that shimmered under the amber lights. My father, Thomas, shook hands with my colleagues like he owned the room. They didn't bring flowers, not even a card. I brushed it off, telling myself it didn't matter, but deep down, it did. Dinner began with laughter and applause. My manager stood up to toast, saying, "Grace is one of the most driven people I've ever met. Her leadership has already inspired us." Everyone clapped, everyone but them. My father chuckled softly, his tone light but cutting. "She's done well, but Emily, her sister, she's saving lives." That's the kind of pride a parent really feels. My mother added quickly, "Grace is smart, of course, but Emily, she's our miracle." The air went cold. Forks froze mid-air. I tried to smile, but my voice betrayed me when I finally spoke. "Do you know what I had to do to get here? I paid for Emily's books, for your bills, for everything this family needed, and you still don't see me." My father leaned back, unbothered, and said the words that would split my life in two. "We wish we never had a daughter like you." The room went silent. The rain outside grew louder, as if it knew what had just ended. That night, I didn't lose a family. I simply stopped pretending I had one. I didn't cry that night. Not when I walked out of that restaurant, not when the rain soaked through my hair and my shoes. I just kept walking, through the sound of traffic, the hum of the city, and the quiet voice in my head, repeating my father's words. "We wish we never had a daughter like you." I didn't go home right away. I wandered through the streets of New York until the rain turned to mist. Every window I passed showed families laughing, clinking glasses, existing together without effort, and I wondered what it must feel like to be loved without conditions. By the time I reached my apartment, it was close to midnight. The city lights shimmered against the wet glass of my window. I took off my heels, set them down by the door, and sat in silence. The quiet wasn't peaceful at first. It was sharp, like a new kind of loneliness I hadn't met before. But beneath it, something else stirred. Something that almost felt like release. The next morning, I woke to 11 missed calls. All from my parents. The first few might have been apologies, I thought, but when I opened the last message, it simply read, "You embarrassed us. I hope you're proud of yourself." I wasn't proud. I was just tired. Tired of trying, tired of being invisible, tired of loving people who treated affection like a reward I hadn't earned yet. That day, something inside me snapped, not out of anger, but exhaustion. I opened my laptop, logged into my bank account, and stared at the list of automatic transfers. One for my parents' utilities, one for Emily's tuition, and another for their mortgage. My hands trembled as I hit cancel. Each click felt like cutting an invisible thread that had been strangling me for years. When the last one disappeared, I exhaled. For the first time in years, I was free from debt that wasn't even mine. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear from them. No calls, no texts, no "we miss you." Just silence. The same silence they'd given me my entire life. Only now, I didn't fill it with guilt. I filled it with work. At the consulting firm where I'd just been hired, I threw myself into projects, strategy meetings, client presentations, late-night revisions. Things I used to do for approval now felt like steps toward my own future. People began to notice me. Really notice. My ideas carried weight. My name was attached to success, not someone else's shadow. In the evenings, my apartment became a space of quiet rebirth. I bought secondhand furniture, a few plants, a soft gray couch, and a small bookshelf filled with novels I'd never had time to read. The air smelled faintly of lavender and candle wax. For the first time, I had built something that was mine. Sometimes my friend Michael would stop by. We'd been friends since college. He'd seen every version of me. The overachiever, the peacemaker, the girl who smiled through every wound. That night, he brought Thai food and a bottle of wine. "Still breathing?" he asked as he stepped inside. "Barely," I said, half laughing. We ate sitting on the floor, chopsticks in hand, surrounded by unopened boxes. The rain drummed softly against the windows. For once, the silence wasn't heavy. It was healing. "You did the right thing," he said after a while. "You can't keep setting yourself on fire to keep others warm." I smiled faintly. "But they're my family." "No," he said gently. "They're your blood. Family is something else, something you choose." His words stayed with me long after he left. I stood by the window that night, watching the city glow, and realized that for the first time, I wasn't living to please anyone. I was simply living. When I finally crawled into bed, I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt empty, but in a good way, like a house that had been cleared of old furniture, waiting for something new. The next morning, I made myself coffee, sat by the window, and opened a blank notebook. On the first page, I wrote one sentence: "I owe no one my peace." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't even particularly wise, but it was true. And for the first time, truth felt enough. The weeks after that morning blurred together like watercolor. Soft edges, muted tones, everything quietly rearranging itself. For the first time in my adult life, there were no demands, no late-night calls about money, no guilt gnawing at the back of my mind. The silence that used to frighten me was becoming my ally, walking past me without waiting for permission. They sat on my couch, the one I had bought with my own money, in the home I built without them. I didn't sit. "Grace," my father began, clearing his throat, "your sister's had some setbacks." "Her internship," my mother cut in, "was terminated. There were staffing cuts, and her tuition payments are overdue. She might lose her spot if we don't help her." I folded my arms. "We? We need your help," my mother said sharply. "Just until she's stable again." It was almost funny. The same mouths that once told me I shouldn't have been born were now asking me to save the daughter they chose over me. I let out a breath, steady and quiet. "You want me to pay for her again?" My father frowned. "You know how much we've invested in her future?" I cut him off, "and how much I've already given to fund it." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with everything that had never been said. "Grace," my mother said, softening her voice, "we're still your parents." "No," I said calmly. "You're people I used to call family." Her face flushed red. "Don't be dramatic." "Blood is blood, not when it's poisoned," I replied. My father rose, his jaw clenched. "You'll regret this someday." "I already have," I said, opening the door. "Every time I thought you'd change." They left without another word. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, my heartbeat loud but steady. No tears this time, just air, clean, cold, and freeing. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, the city lights stretching endlessly below. I thought of Emily, The sister who never stood up for me, who took every sacrifice without question. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance, the kind that finally meant peace. The days after that confrontation felt eerily calm, like the quiet after a storm that had been building for years. My apartment no longer smelled of anxiety. It smelled of lavender candles and fresh coffee. The tension that used to live in my chest had finally moved out, replaced by something new: space. At the firm, things began to shift too. My manager called me into his office one morning and said, "Grace, I want you to lead the Redmond project. It's a huge account. You've earned it?" I nodded, half in disbelief. The old version of me, the one desperate for approval, would have called her parents right away. But the new me just smiled and said thank you. Because this time, I wasn't achieving for them. I was doing it for me. The project consumed me for weeks, late nights, endless presentations, strategy decks that covered entire walls. But it wasn't burnout. It was purpose. For the first time, my exhaustion felt clean. Not something taken from me, but something I chose to give. My name started appearing in internal memos. Executives started asking for me in meetings. It was strange learning to stand in the spotlight without apologizing for it. At night, when I got home, I'd light a candle, pour a glass of red wine, and cook dinner. Real dinner, not the takeout I used to eat while working on budgets for my parents. I'd play music softly and let my mind wander. There was peace in these small rituals, a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. Michael noticed it too. One evening, he dropped by with groceries. "You've changed," he said, unloading pasta, tomatoes, and basil onto the counter. I laughed. "In a good way, I hope." "In the best way," he said, smiling. "You look unburdened." We cooked together that night, the apartment filled with the scent of garlic and laughter, something I hadn't heard from myself in a long time. After dinner, we sat on the couch, half a bottle of wine between us. "You know what's funny?" I said. "I spent my whole life trying to be the daughter they wanted. And now that I've stopped trying, I finally feel like myself." "That's not funny," he said softly. "That's growth." There was a warmth in his eyes that made me pause. For years, Michael had been the friend who reminded me I wasn't crazy for wanting love that didn't hurt. But in that moment, I wondered if he'd been something more all along, not the family I lost, but the family I'd been quietly building. A few days later, my article was published. It wasn't planned. A journalist from a business magazine had reached out after our Redmond project made headlines. They wanted to profile young leaders redefining resilience. I hesitated at first. I didn't want to expose my past. But the truth was, my story wasn't about shame anymore. It was about survival. In the interview, I spoke honestly, not about names or family drama, but about what it means to grow up unseen, to fight for validation that never comes, and to finally stop chasing it. "You can't earn love from people who use it as a weapon," I said. When the article came out, it spread faster than I expected. LinkedIn posts, reshares, messages from strangers saying, "I felt this," or "You told my story." One woman wrote, "I read your words and finally had the courage to move out." Another said, "Thank you for giving me permission to stop begging." Each message felt like a small piece of my old pain turning into something useful. I hadn't just survived. I had helped others do the same. But not everyone saw it that way. A week later, the email started, from my parents. Short, cold, accusing. "You've humiliated this family. How dare you talk about us publicly? Your sister is suffering, and you're out there bragging." I didn't reply. Not once. Because every word they wrote only proved what I had already learned, that their love had always been conditional. And I was done paying the price. One evening, I sat by my window, the skyline glowing against the night. My reflection in the glass looked different, not harder, but steadier. I realized I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted peace. And maybe that was the truest form of justice. Michael texted me that night. "Did you see the article?" "You're kind of a big deal now." I smiled and typed back, "Just trying to live quietly for once." "Grace," he replied, "you didn't just live. You changed the story." I looked out at the lights of New York, the same city where I'd once walked alone in the rain, believing I had no one. And I realized something profound. The silence that used to feel like punishment had become my anthem. I wasn't the daughter they wanted, but I was finally the woman I was meant to be. The more the article spread, the quieter my phone became. My parents' messages eventually stopped, replaced by a long, heavy silence. But this time it didn't suffocate me. It soothed me. It was the silence of distance, of boundaries finally being honored. At the firm, things only grew brighter. Our project's success led to a contract renewal worth millions, and my manager called me into his office again. "Grace," he said, smiling, "how does Director of Strategy sound to you?" I didn't cry, though the old me might have. I just smiled and said, "It sounds like I've finally come home to myself." Later that week, I hosted a small dinner at my apartment to celebrate. Nothing extravagant, just a few colleagues, soft jazz, and candles flickering along the table. Michael arrived last, as he always did, carrying a bottle of red wine and his usual grin. "Look at this," he said, glancing around the room. "You did it, Grace. You built a life that looks nothing like what they imagined, and everything like what you deserve." His words settled into the quiet space between us, like truth finding its final home. As the night went on, laughter filled the apartment. No one talked about my family or about what I had lost. They just saw me, as I was, not as someone's daughter or sister, but as Grace. When everyone finally left, Michael stayed behind to help clean up. We worked in easy silence, stacking plates, rinsing glasses. The scent of wine and roasted garlic lingered in the air. "Do you ever miss them?" he asked softly. I thought for a long moment. "I miss what I thought they could be," I admitted, "but not who they were." He nodded, understanding. "You know," he said, "some people are meant to teach us how not to love." That night, after he left, I stood on my balcony, the city stretching endlessly below. The cool wind brushed my face, and for the first time, I realized I didn't feel small anymore. The skyline no longer towered above me, it surrounded me, like an equal. I sipped the last of my wine and looked at the faint reflection of my own face in the glass door. There was strength there now, quiet, steady strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. I thought about the dinner months ago, the one where my father had looked at me and said, "We wish we never had a daughter like you." Back then, those words had destroyed me, but now they meant something else. They weren't a curse anymore. They were freedom. Because if they wished I'd never been born, then they no longer had power over the woman I'd become. I turned off the lights, letting the soft glow of the city spill into my living room. The apartment felt alive. Not because of the furniture or the view, but because of the peace that filled it. Before bed, I opened my laptop to check my messages. Dozens of unread emails, not from clients this time, but from strangers. People who had read my story and found themselves in it. One woman wrote, "I'm 57, and I've spent my whole life chasing approval. Your story made me realize I don't have to anymore." I smiled through tears I didn't expect. Somehow my pain had turned into someone else's permission to heal. And maybe that was the point all along, not to get back at them, not to prove them wrong, but to finally understand that healing isn't loud. It's quiet. It happens in rooms you've built for yourself, surrounded by people who see you clearly. The night of the small celebration felt different, lighter, softer, almost sacred. My apartment glowed in warm amber light, filled with laughter and the quiet hum of jazz. Michael sat across the table, refilling glasses as our friends toasted to new beginnings. "To Grace," someone said, smiling, "for choosing peace over approval." Everyone clinked their glasses, and I couldn't help but laugh. A real, unguarded laugh. It felt strange, and yet so right to be surrounded by people who saw me not for what I'd done, but for who I had become. When the room finally emptied, I stood alone by the window, watching the city lights shimmer like constellations. For years, I had begged for my parents' love, mistaking their silence for something I needed to fix. But now, I understood. Silence can be strength, too. You don't need to earn love that was never freely given. You don't need to apologize for protecting your peace. I used to think family was something you were born into. But standing there, barefoot on the cold hardwood floor, I realized something deeper. Family is what you build. It's the people who stay when the noise fades, who celebrate you when no one else claps. The city outside pulsed with life, and I could almost hear it whisper, "You made it." I took a breath and smiled, whispering into the quiet, "I'm not the daughter they wanted, but I'm finally mine." In that moment, I knew this wasn't just my ending, it was a beginning. And if you've ever stood where I stood, choosing peace over pain, learning to love yourself after being forgotten, then this story is yours too. Because every time someone hears it, maybe they'll remember, it's never too late to walk away from what breaks you and walk toward what heals you. So if this story touched you, stay with us. Click like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, because every heart, every comment, every story told here becomes part of a larger truth, that healing isn't loud, it's brave. And sometimes, the quietest endings are the ones that echo the loudest. At work, I threw myself into a new project, a restructuring plan for a Fortune 500 client, the kind of assignment that could make or break a young consultant's career. I spent hours in glass-walled meeting rooms filled with charts, numbers, and ideas. People listened when I spoke. They asked for my input, and every time my manager said, "Good work, Grace," something in me loosened, like a knot slowly coming undone. But even success can't fill an old wound completely. Some nights I'd still wake up at 2 a.m. to phantom thoughts, the echo of my father's voice, the image of my mother's disapproving stare. I'd reach for my phone, not to call them, but to remind myself I didn't have to anymore. That small act, resisting the old instinct to explain myself, was its own kind of healing. Michael became a regular visitor during those quiet weeks. He'd bring takeout or a bottle of cheap wine, insisting that therapy doesn't always need a couch. Sometimes we'd talk about work, other times we'd just sit in silence, listening to old jazz records from our college days. One evening, he looked around my apartment, the soft lamplight reflecting off his glass. "You know," he said, "this place finally looks like you." I laughed. "What does me even look like?" He smiled. Calm, warm, a little messy, but in a human way. It was such a simple thing to say, but it stuck. For years I had been shaped by what my parents thought I should be, useful, obedient, low maintenance. I had spent so long trying to earn love that I had forgotten how to just exist without permission. The following Friday, I got home late from work, kicked off my heels, and opened my laptop. Dozens of unread emails blinked on the screen, most from clients and coworkers, and then one that froze me. From Mom. The subject line read, "We need to talk." My chest tightened. For a moment I hovered over the message, half tempted to delete it. But curiosity, or maybe old habit, won. The email was short, written in my mother's signature tone of controlled urgency. "Grace, your sister's in trouble. Her internship at the hospital has been cut. She's struggling financially. You know how important this is for her future. Please call us." I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. No apology. No acknowledgement. Not a single word about the night at the restaurant. Just a new demand, wrapped in old entitlement. I didn't respond. Not that night, not the next morning. For once, I didn't rush to fix what wasn't mine to fix. I went to work, led my meetings, came home, and let the silence stretch between us like a steel wall. 3 days later, there was a knock on my door. Sharp, firm, the kind of knock that doesn't ask, it expects. When I opened it, There they were, my parents, standing in the hallway like they still owned the right to enter my life. My mother clutched her purse tightly, her lips drawn into a thin line. My father wore the same expression he had at that dinner, composed, superior, unreadable. "We need to talk," my mother said,